We have two readings today that kind of touch on the prophet Elijah. And Elijah, I don't know how familiar you are with this story, but Elijah was one of the three great prophets of ancient Israel, along with Moses and Samuel, in the stories that we have in the histories of the Old Testament. And of course, we know who Moses was, and Samuel was there at the formation of the kingdom as the one who anointed David. And Elijah was a prophet in the time of the monarchy, 100 years or more after King David and Solomon had died. And he lived in a time of great turmoil in Israel where there was a lot of consternation over the proper worship of God when the kingdom itself was threatened, and he saw this backsliding in their observance of the covenant, and he sort of railed against it at great personal cost. There are lots of stories of Elijah. He was the mortal enemy. You might remember Jezebel. You've heard that name before. Who was the wife of the king and who had sort of led the king astray into the worship of false gods. And Elijah, pronounced against this. But here we have the story of Elijah near the end of his time on earth, and he's with his disciple Elisha, which is kind of confusing. You think he might have given him a nickname or something to tell them apart, but it's Elijah and Elisha, which is really similar, but not exactly the same. So we have the story here of Elijah, and he's traveling around through Israel, and he's with his disciple Elisha. And we get to sort of the end of Elijah's time. Now, technically, Elijah doesn't die. He is taken up directly into heaven. And yet what we see in Elijah is very much the experience of loss and an experience of grief. And though Elijah may be present with God, he is still missing in Elisha's life. The whole of his absence is noticed and felt keenly. And I was thinking about this today because I love this image of the chariots of fire kind of coming down out of the heavens to take Elijah back up into the presence of God. And it made me think of the movie. Do you remember the movie Chariots of Fire? Came out like 1982, and it's about Olympic athletes, in the early part of the 20th century. It's a very inspiring story. And I was thinking of that because when I was in school, in high school, that movie came out, I was on the track team, and the whole team went together to see the movie. We all went down to the mall, and we met, and we saw this movie together. It was very inspiring for us. And it made me think of a fella who was on the track team with me. His name was David. And David was someone I had known I think pretty much my whole life. I met him, I think, in grade school. I don't really remember meeting him, but I don't really remember him not kind of being around. He's kind of one of those characters. And he was a great runner. He was a long-distance runner. He was also on the cross-country team. And I think he was on the swim team as well. And he was sort of a tall, skinny kid, as you would imagine, like a cross-country runner. And he was a pretty pale white dude, but he had this like tight curly hair, so he had like a big afro. And what really stood out for me, he was a super nice guy. I mean, very affable. Everybody liked him. He got along with everyone. Never had anything unkind to say with anyone. A much nicer person than I was, certainly in high school, probably now too. And what really struck out for me with David is his parents were deaf. And so he was the first person I ever encountered who knew American Sign Language. I don't think I'd ever seen sign language before until one day David was probably middle school, and we had some kind of parents thing where the parents were visiting, and David was sort of translating for his parents, right? The teacher would say something, and he would translate for them. And I remember I really have that image kind of stuck in my head. And like me, after high school, David went into the Navy. I didn't see him then or anything, but I know that's what he did. And like me, he chose not to go back to Indiana. It's a great place to be from, Indiana. But David stayed in California, whereas I stayed in New York. I think maybe I should have stayed in San Diego with David. But anyway, I love New York, don't get me wrong, but I mean, San Diego's really nice. And, but he stayed there and he had a career in law enforcement and everything. And the truth is, David died about a year and a half ago, kind of unexpectedly. And he wasn't like a really close friend or anything. We weren't like talking to each other. We weren't like really close buddies, but we kind of were connected on Facebook, and he was kind of starting something new in his life, and it seemed like a really hopeful time. He was still out running, every day and being fit, and I'm still running to Dunkin' Donuts every day, and so he was, a little bit better off than me. But he had a heart attack, and he died. And it really hit me. I'm like, this is not someone that I'm really close to. He wasn't like a close friend or confidant or something. He was just someone who was kind of just there in my life, kind of a positive force, I guess, to the extent that he exerted any influence over me. But I felt his loss really keenly. And I still don't really know why. Maybe it's because, we were in school together. I've known him since childhood, and he's not the first person from my childhood who's died, but I don't know, we had more in common than some other people, perhaps. Maybe it was because, I had gone through some other losses around that time, and so it just kind of hit a little closer to home than it might have been otherwise. I don't really know. I don't really know why I had this reaction, but I did. And so I was thinking about that when I looked at this story of Elisha and Elijah today. And I think that grief is one of those things that all of us have probably, at this point in our lives, experienced. I imagine everybody sitting here today, in fact, I know for sure for many of you, you have experienced the loss of someone that was meaningful and important in your life, that you have carried that loss with you. And what I know I have found in my own life is that the weight of grief, the weight of loss, doesn't really change or go away. That the hole in my life that is made by the departure of someone that I loved doesn't really get smaller. And the burden of their loss doesn't really get lighter. But my ability to sort of pick up the weight of that loss and carry it does get better. That over time that I'm able to take the burden and the weight of that, and it doesn't feel quite so heavy. Even though I'm still carrying it on my back, I don't notice it as much as I used to. And of course, there are seasons and times when, like the tides, that sense of loss and grief kind of comes and goes, right? When we have an encounter where there's something that makes us think of someone and their loss is brought right back up to the present. I know recently there's a TV show now called Reacher. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's based on some books, and he's like a guy who goes around helping people, but in kind of really violent ways. Anyway, my mother loved these books. She loved Jack Reacher. And every time I watch a show, I think, I'd love to call my mom and tell her about this. She would love this. Because they made a movie with Tom Cruise that was terrible. She really hated that. And so I know she would like this one because it's really much closer to the books. And so every time, I feel that loss of her, which has been over a year now, kind of come back, right? Many of us have probably had this kind of experience. And yet I have also found in my life of faith that there is some consolation in the idea that our existence is not bound by our birth and our death. That our time in this world is not the full word of who we are or what we will be. That through Jesus, we are somehow participants in his resurrected life. And I think one of the big things about Jesus that really changes things for not just us personally, but for humanity as a whole is that in the crucifixion, that God experiences death in a way that is like how we experience death, a keenly felt loss. And I think the truth is that if Jesus isn't willing to really die, that if his death isn't as real as our deaths, then it's really not much of a sacrifice. Jesus didn't go into the crucifixion knowing for sure that he would be resurrected. But he went into the crucifixion with faith and a belief and trust in God that it would not be his end. So I think as we go through our lives and we experience our own griefs, our own losses, that we too, like Jesus, can move into those losses with faith that it isn't the final word on their existence. And it's not a weight that will be unbearable for us unnecessarily. And I think that the hole that is left behind for us can be filled with the love of God. And that we can find the strength and the ability to carry on. Just as Elisha did, who went on to become, in his own right, a great prophet, but who always carried with him the memory of Elijah. And we see in this mountaintop story of the Transfiguration a reminder that the experiences and seasons of our life are not forever. In the same way that the disciples couldn't stay on that mountaintop basking in the glory of the transfigured Jesus with Moses and Elijah, the great prophets, that they had to go away from that glory back down into the valley of life's cares and concerns. In the same way that our experience of the lowest points of our lives is not the place where we have to spend the rest of our lives. That we too can come up out of the valley of our grief and our loss, and perhaps even attain to the heights of the transfiguration at the mountaintop. But the road for us continues, and that through faith we have a guiding light to show us the way, and a strength to carry us when we can't go on any further, and a courage to help us in their deepest and darkest fears. That though grief and loss is a part of life, that even in our darkest days, the love of God does not depart from us and will be there to strengthen us and to carry us and to hold us close and to remind us that death is not the end for us, but a transition into something else. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. But like Jesus, I have faith and trust in God's promises. That the final word on our existence is not death, but life, abundant, eternal life. Amen.